No one in Ashford Manor breathed when the Duke said the word mine. Emily Carter stood beneath the crystal chandelier with her wedding ring cold against her finger and a smile still trembling on her beautiful face, the kind of bright, stubborn smile she had learned to wear when every candle in the room seemed determined to expose her shame. She was only 20 now, but the house had made her older in silence, dressing her lively spirit in grey mornings, locked doors, and dinners where no one asked whether she had eaten. Yet there was still light in her. It flashed in the quick lift of her chin, in the soft gold of her hair pinned with a blue ribbon she had chosen simply because she refused to let grief decide every color she wore, in the warm hazel eyes that had once laughed easily over wildflowers, piano keys, and summer races across the lawns of her childhood home. That girl was not dead. Not entirely. But on that winter evening, with rain crawling down the tall windows and the servants lined like statues along the walls, William Ashford seemed intent on burying what remained of her. He stood beside Vanessa Hale near the grand staircase, his expression polished and empty, one hand resting lightly on the carved banister as if this were no more than a household announcement. Vanessa wore ivory silk, not white enough to be called bridal, but close enough to wound. Around her wrist gleamed a bracelet Emily recognized at once, a pearl piece that had belonged to Emily's mother and had vanished from her dressing table 3 weeks earlier. "Miss Hale will take the south apartments," William said, his voice calm enough to be cruel. "You will see that she is given every comfort due to a guest of importance." A guest. The word drifted through the hall like cold ash. Emily's fingers folded around the small ring of household keys at her waist. Those keys had been placed in her hands on the morning after her wedding, when she was 17, frightened, radiant, and determined to become worthy of a husband who had never once looked at her as if she were a blessing. She had kept his house running through shortages, illness, failed harvests, and long seasons of his absence. She had remembered every servant's child by name. She had turned freezing rooms warm with thrift and cleverness. She had filled the chapel with flowers when no one else cared that the pews smelled of dust. But now Vanessa stepped forward with a delicate laugh and held out her gloved hand. "I suppose those belong to me now." Emily looked at the keys. Then at William. Some small, hopeful part of her waited for him to correct the insult. He did not. "Give them to her," he said. The hall went so still that the tick of the long case clock sounded like a verdict. Emily's smile did not disappear. It merely grew softer, sadder, almost luminous. "As you wish, my lord." She lifted the keys, but Vanessa did not take them gently. Her fingers closed over Emily's hand, lingering just long enough for everyone to see the exchange, long enough to make surrender look like ceremony. Then her gaze dropped to Emily's wedding ring. "How curious," Vanessa murmured. "A wife with no room, no table, and no husband still keeps the symbol." A few servants lowered their eyes. Emily's cheeks warmed, but she did not pull away. She had endured worse with less light in the room. Vanessa smiled and touched the ring as if it were a loose thread on a gown. "Perhaps we should remove what no longer suits the house." That was when the front doors opened. Wind moved through the manor, carrying the scent of rain, leather, and winter leaves. Every candle bent. Duke Alexander Whitmore stepped into the hall in a dark coat beaded with silver drops, tall and severe against the storm behind him, his grey eyes taking in the scene with a silence sharper than any shout. He had come to speak with William about boundary lands. He found instead a young duchess standing alone before a household that had mistaken patience for permission. His gaze moved from Vanessa's hand on Emily's ring, to William's cold face, to the keys caught between two women like the last fragment of a crown. "Release her," he said. Vanessa startled, but pride held her in place. "Your Grace, this is a private matter." Alexander crossed the marble floor without haste. That made it worse. Each step was measured, controlled, final. He stopped beside Emily, not touching her at first, only standing close enough that the room understood she was no longer unprotected. Emily looked up at him, and for one brief second, the lively girl buried beneath years of quiet humiliation flickered through her eyes, startled, bright, almost disbelieving. Alexander saw it. He saw the beauty everyone had used, the courage everyone had ignored, and the dignity no one in that house had deserved. Then he placed his gloved hand over Vanessa's and removed it from Emily's fingers with perfect restraint. "Touch her again," he said, his voice low enough to make the silence lean closer, "and you answer to me." William's jaw tightened. "She is my wife." Alexander turned his eyes on him. "Then you should have remembered she was human." The words struck the hall harder than thunder. Emily's breath caught, not because he had claimed her, but because he had seen her. Vanessa stepped back, pale with anger. William took one step forward. "You overreach, Whitmore." The Duke did not move. He only took the ring of keys from Emily's trembling hand, closed her fingers gently around them again, and said the word that would follow every whisper in the county by morning. "Mine." Emily had been 17 when she first entered Ashford Manor as a bride, and the memory returned to her that stormy night with such clarity that even Duke Alexander Whitmore's voice seemed to fade behind the sound of church bells from 3 years before. She had stood at the chapel doors in a gown that did not quite fit, too wide at the shoulders, too long at the hem, altered from her mother's wedding dress because there had been no money for a new one. Still, she had looked beautiful in it. Everyone had said so. Her cheeks had been bright with nervous color, her hazel eyes alive with the kind of hope only a lively young girl could carry into a room full of bargains and call it destiny. She had smiled at the flower girls. She had whispered encouragement to her trembling younger cousin. She had even laughed softly when a gust of March wind sent her veil fluttering around her face like a startled dove. That laugh had been the last sound of girlhood she remembered making without caution. At the altar, William Ashford had waited with his hands folded before him, handsome, distant, and perfectly still. He was 27 then, already shaped by discipline and disappointment, with dark blonde hair combed neatly back and blue eyes that seemed to pass over her rather than rest upon her. Emily had told herself he was only solemn because important men were often solemn. She had told herself affection could come later, that kindness might grow in a house where duty had planted the first seed. Her father's debts had emptied the Carter estate, and the marriage contract had saved her mother from losing the last roof over her head. Emily understood that. She had signed her name carefully, the letters round and graceful, her hand only shaking once. When William placed the ring on her finger, his touch was cool and brief. When the minister told him he might kiss his bride, he brushed his lips against her forehead as one might bless a child before sending her away. The wedding breakfast was grand enough to hide the poverty behind it. There were sugared almonds in silver bowls, white roses on every table, and music that tried too hard to be cheerful. Emily moved through it with a bright smile, thanking guests, remembering names, making people laugh because that was what she did when she was frightened. William watched from across the room with an expression she did not yet know how to read. Before sunset, they arrived at Ashford Manor, 10 miles from the chapel, its stone towers rising above bare trees like a verdict carved against the pale sky. The entrance hall smelled of wax, cedar, and old rain. A housekeeper placed the keys in Emily's hands and called her mistress of the house. The word made her heart lift. Mistress. Not burden. Not payment. Not child. Someone necessary. That evening, Emily changed into a pale blue dress and waited in the dining room for William. She waited through the first course. Then the second. At 9 o'clock, a servant entered and told her his lordship had been detained in the library. At 10, the candles had burned low. At 11, she walked softly down the corridor and saw lamplight beneath the library door. She raised her hand to knock, then heard William speaking inside, his voice flat with exhaustion. She is too young to understand what this marriage is. Another man answered, perhaps his solicitor, perhaps his friend. Emily never knew. Then teach her gently. William said nothing for a long moment. Then came the sentence that settled into the walls of her life. I did not marry her to be gentle. Emily stepped back before anyone could see her. She did not cry. Not then. She returned to the dining room, folded her napkin, and thanked the footman for waiting up so late. In her bedchamber, a fire had been lit, but the room still felt cold. She sat before the mirror and removed the pins from her golden hair one by one, watching the curls fall around a face that still looked too young for the name she had been given. Lady Ashford. Wife. Mistress of a manor whose master had already withdrawn from her. Near dawn, William left the house for London on business. He sent no farewell, only a note in clean black ink: "Manage the household as you are instructed." Emily read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of her writing desk. By breakfast, she was smiling again. By noon, she had learned the names of 12 servants. By evening, she had found the pantry accounts in disorder and corrected them with a steady hand. If love would not meet her at the door, she would still make herself useful. If tenderness would not be given, she would give warmth elsewhere. And so the lively girl in the blue ribbon began learning how to survive a house that mistook silence for obedience. By the end of her first year at Ashford Manor, Emily Carter had learned that a person could be present in every room and still be treated like an echo. Her name appeared on invitation cards in careful ink, her initials were stitched into household linens, and the servants curtsied when she passed, yet the house never truly belonged to her. It belonged to William's silence. It belonged to the closed library door. It belonged to the empty chair at dinner, the unanswered letters, the footsteps that crossed the corridor past midnight and never paused outside her chamber. Still, Emily refused to become dull. Each morning, she woke before the bells and opened the curtains herself, letting pale sunlight pour across the carved bedposts and the blue ribbon box on her vanity. She chose colors when others expected morning shades. Soft green for rainy days. Rose pink when the sky was gray. Butter yellow in summer, because the kitchen maids smiled when they saw it. She walked the gardens with a basket over one arm, gathering flowers for rooms William never entered. She taught the scullery boy to read by tracing letters in spilled flour. She helped the elderly gardener plan new lavender borders along the east walk. Sometimes, when no one was near, she ran across the lawn with her skirts lifted above the wet grass, laughing breathlessly at the shock of cold air in her lungs. Then she would stop at the sight of a window, remembering herself, remembering the title around her neck like a chain of pearls. Lady Ashford. Proper. Quiet. Unwanted. The world beyond the manor believed she lived in comfort. They saw the carriage, the stone gates, the silver service, the footmen in livery. They did not see how William's instructions slowly removed her from the center of her own life. First, the estate correspondence was redirected to his steward. Then the accounts were reviewed without her. Then visiting cards from neighboring families were answered by William's secretary, who wrote that Lady Ashford was indisposed, even on mornings when Emily sat in the drawing room fully dressed, waiting for callers who never came. Her place at the head of the dinner table remained, but more and more often, meals were sent to her sitting room under the polite excuse that his lordship had business requiring privacy. "It is only temporary," Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, once whispered while setting down a tray of roasted chicken and glazed carrots. Emily smiled at her as if kindness could mend humiliation. "Most winters are," she said. But it was not winter. It was June, warm enough for roses to climb the south wall and bees to drift lazily through the open windows. William returned from London that month with a new manner, not warmer, but sharpened by impatience. He noticed the flowers Emily had placed in the hall and ordered them removed because their scent distracted him. He noticed the village children gathered near the old schoolhouse and asked why estate funds were being spent on slates and books. Emily explained, gently, that the roof had leaked for 2 years and the teacher had gone unpaid since Christmas. William looked at her across the breakfast table with a faint crease between his brows. "You concern yourself with sentimental details." Emily lowered her teacup. "Children learning to read is not sentimental. It is not your concern." The words were quiet. That made them colder. Emily felt the old brightness in her eyes, quick and brave, the part of her that had once climbed apple trees and argued with boys twice her size over who could run faster to the creek. Then what is my concern, William? He folded his newspaper with exact care. To maintain dignity and avoid making yourself conspicuous. She absorbed the sentence without flinching. I see. He left for London again before noon. Emily stood at the window and watched his carriage disappear down the gravel drive, raising a thin cloud of dust behind it. Her reflection hovered in the glass, beautiful, young, composed, with sunlight touching her golden hair and grief held carefully behind her hazel eyes. That afternoon, she walked to the village schoolhouse herself. It stood nearly 2 miles from the manor, down a narrow road bordered by stone walls and wild blackberries. She wore her oldest boots and carried a ledger beneath her arm. By sunset, she had arranged for repairs using money from the sale of a sapphire pin William had never noticed she owned. When the first rain came through the newly patched roof weeks later, not a single drop fell on the children's desks. Emily laughed with them then, bright and unguarded, her face lifted toward the rafters as if joy could still find her in small rooms. She did not know that one of William's men had seen her there, kneeling on the dusty floor beside a little girl with ink on her fingers. She did not know the report would reach her husband by morning. She only knew that for 1 hour, no one had treated her like a ghost. The report reached William Ashford before breakfast, folded inside a cream envelope and placed beside his coffee as neatly as if it contained nothing more troubling than weather. Emily was in the conservatory when he read it, laughing softly with a housemaid over a stubborn orange tree that refused to bloom though she had spoken to it every morning as if encouragement might shame it into life. Sunlight washed through the glass panes and caught in her golden hair, turning the loose curls around her temples bright as candle flame. She wore a pale blue morning dress and no jewels except her wedding ring, and for a moment, with soil on one fingertip and amusement in her hazel eyes, she looked less like the forgotten wife of Ashford Manor than the lively girl she had been before marriage taught her how quietly hope could be punished. William stood at the conservatory door and watched her smile disappear when she saw him. That troubled him more than her laughter had. You sold a sapphire pin, he said. The maid curtsied and fled before Emily could excuse her. Leaves trembled in the warm air. Emily wiped her finger on a linen cloth and faced him calmly. Yes. To repair a village school without my permission. To repair a roof before another storm ruined the books. You used property that came into this house through marriage. She tilted her head slightly, a familiar brightness stirring beneath her restraint. It was my mother's pin. You are Lady Ashford. What was yours is now tied to this estate. Then perhaps the estate has finally done something decent with it. Silence fell between the orange trees. William's expression did not change, but something cold moved behind his eyes, not rage, not quite. Displeasure sharpened by the knowledge that she had acted without fear. You mistake charity for wisdom, he said. And you mistake control for order. The words escaped before she could soften them. For one wonderful, dangerous second, Emily felt alive. Then William stepped farther into the conservatory, his black coat cutting through the green warmth like a shadow. You will not visit the village without approval again. You will not spend money without review. You will not entertain ideas of becoming beloved among people who owe loyalty to my name. Emily's smile returned, fragile but unmistakable. They know your name, William. They know my hands. His jaw tightened. He left without another word, but by evening, the carriage house was locked, and the next morning, Emily learned that her personal account had been transferred under the supervision of William's steward. No announcement was made. No accusation was spoken. That was how he preferred to punish her, not with noise, but with removal. One privilege at a time. One window closed. One key taken. Weeks passed. Emily continued to smile, though the smiles became smaller and more carefully placed. She read to the servants' children in the laundry room instead of the village schoolhouse. She mended old curtains into blankets for families near the North Fields. She wrote letters she never sent to her mother because she could not bear to confess that comfort had become a cage lined with velvet. Then, in late September, William returned from London with Vanessa Hale. The first sign was laughter in the entrance hall, low and musical, too confident to belong to a visitor uncertain of her welcome. Emily came down the staircase wearing a soft green dress, her cheeks warmed from walking in the garden, a basket of late roses hooked over her arm. She stopped halfway down. Vanessa stood beside William beneath the ancestral portraits, removing white gloves finger by finger while she studied the house as if already measuring where her portrait might hang. She was beautiful in a polished way, dark-haired, pale, and smiling without kindness. William did not look embarrassed. That was the first cruelty. "Emily," he said, as if introducing a neighbor over tea, "this is Miss Vanessa Hale. She will remain with us for the season." Emily's fingers tightened around the basket handle. A few rose petals fell onto the stone step. "Welcome to Ashford Manor, Miss Hale," she said, her voice clear and gracious because pride was the last room no one had managed to take from her. Vanessa's eyes drifted over her, lingering on the simple dress, the garden dust at the hem, the unguarded beauty that no neglect had been able to erase. "How charming," she said. "I expected someone much colder." Emily descended the remaining stairs. "The house is cold enough. I try not to add to it." A footman looked down quickly, hiding the smallest smile. Vanessa noticed. So did William. His face hardened. "Miss Hale will have the south apartments." Emily looked at him then. The south apartments had been prepared for her mother's visits, filled with yellow silk curtains and the best morning light. "Those rooms are mine to assign." "Not anymore," William said. 2 words. Quiet. Final. Something inside Emily folded but did not break. She gave a small nod and handed the basket of roses to the nearest maid. "Then they should have fresh flowers." Vanessa smiled as if she had one. Emily smiled back as if she had survived worse, because she had, though the worst was only beginning. Vanessa Hale settled into the south apartments as if she had been born beneath their yellow silk curtains, and within 3 days, the servants knew to lower their voices when passing her door. She requested new flowers each morning, not the wild roses Emily preferred, but pale lilies and white camellias arranged in silver vases that had belonged to William's grandmother. She ordered her breakfast on trays painted with the Ashford crest. She walked through the gallery with William at her side, asking careless questions about portraits whose names Emily had spent years learning by heart. Each small liberty was chosen with care. Each smile was a needle wrapped in velvet. Emily watched it all with the bright composure of a woman who had learned to stand still while the floor was taken from beneath her. She continued her rounds, still beautiful, still lively in the moments she could steal for herself, still pausing to make the youngest kitchen maid laugh by pretending to consult the orange tree like a difficult old professor. Yet even her laughter changed after Vanessa arrived. It came quickly, then vanished, as if afraid of being overheard. On the 4th evening, Emily found her mother's pearl bracelet on Vanessa's wrist. The sight stopped her in the corridor outside the music room, where rain tapped lightly against the windows and a coal fire painted the walls in amber. Vanessa stood near the piano, turning her wrist this way and that while William reviewed letters by the mantel. "That bracelet was in my private dressing case," Emily said. Her voice was gentle. Too gentle. Vanessa glanced down as though surprised by the pearls. "Was it?" William said the jewelry here was rather neglected. Emily looked at her husband. "You gave it to her?" William did not lift his eyes from the letter. It suited her. The sentence was simple enough to be dismissed as nothing. That made it unbearable. Emily remembered her mother fastening those pearls around her wrist on the night before the wedding, whispering that a lady must carry beauty into hard places because beauty reminded the soul not to surrender. For a moment, the room blurred at the edges. Then Emily smiled, and the smile was so radiant, so impossibly brave, that even Vanessa's expression faltered. Then I hope Miss Hale understands she is wearing something loved. Vanessa's fingers stilled on the bracelet. William finally looked up. He had expected tears, perhaps a plea, perhaps a scene that would allow him to call her childish. Instead, Emily turned to the piano, touched one key lightly, and let the note tremble through the room like a small silver bell. "My mother taught me that song," she said. "Before we lost most things." She left before either of them could answer. Downstairs, Mrs. Bell found her in the linen room with both hands pressed to a stack of folded sheets, breathing carefully, her face pale but dry-eyed. "My lady," the housekeeper whispered. Emily looked up at once and gave her usual quick smile, the one meant to comfort others before herself. "It is all right. I only came to count the winter blankets. You need not pretend with me." That nearly undid her. Nearly. Emily reached for the ledger and opened it with steady fingers. "Then help me decide which families need coal first. The north cottages will freeze early if the wind turns." So they worked until midnight, marking names, calculating costs, finding mercy inside numbers. The next morning, Emily walked 2 miles to the tenant cottages because the carriage house remained locked to her. Her boots were damp by the time she arrived, and the hem of her blue dress was freckled with mud, but her cheeks glowed from the cold and the children ran to meet her as if sunshine had taken human shape. She brought books, apples, and 3 wool blankets folded in brown paper. She listened to Mrs. Turner describe her husband's injured hand, promised to speak with the steward about lighter work, and knelt beside a little boy who had built a castle from sticks. For an hour, she was not unwanted. She was Miss Emily to those who had known her before titles made her distant. She laughed when the children crowned her with a chain of late daisies, and the sound carried over the damp fields, clear and young and heartbreakingly alive. From the ridge road above the cottages, Duke Alexander Whitmore reined in his black horse. He had come to inspect the boundary stones near Ashford Land, expecting to meet William's steward, not a golden-haired young duchess kneeling in the mud while children placed flowers in her hair. Alexander had seen many beautiful women in ballrooms. He had seen women dressed in diamonds, trained in charm, polished until no honest feeling remained visible. He had not seen one give away warmth while standing in the cold. Emily rose then, brushing mud from her skirt, and turned her face toward the wind. Her smile faded when she noticed him, replaced by careful dignity. Alexander removed his hat. She curtsied, graceful even with damp boots and daisies slipping from her hair. "Your Grace," she said. "Lady Ashford," he replied, though something in him resisted the name that tied her to a house which clearly did not know her worth. Emily had expected Duke Alexander Whitmore to pass with a formal greeting and continue along the ridge road, leaving her to gather the fallen daisies from her hair and pretend he had not seen the mud on her hem or the tenderness she tried so carefully to hide. Instead, he dismounted with the quiet ease of a man who had never needed to hurry in order to command attention. His black horse stamped softly in the damp grass while the children fell into astonished silence, staring at the tall Duke in his dark riding coat as though a figure from a winter painting had stepped down among them. Emily straightened at once, cheeks bright from cold and embarrassment, one hand smoothing her skirt though the effort did little good. "I was told the Ashford steward would meet me near the boundary stones," Alexander said. His voice was low, controlled, not unkind. "Mr. Vale is often delayed when the weather turns," Emily replied. "The lower road floods before noon." "And you know this because you walk it?" She glanced toward the children, then back at him, her smile returning with a flicker of mischief she had not meant to reveal. "A person notices many things when she is not allowed the carriage." The words hung between them. Not a complaint. Not a plea. Merely truth, lightly offered, which made it sharper. Alexander's gaze moved to her damp boots, then to the wool blankets stacked near Mrs. Turner's door, then to the little boy holding an apple with both hands as if it were treasure. "Do you bring supplies often?" Emily lifted one shoulder. only when the house has more than it needs and the village has less. And does Lord Ashford approve? Her smile dimmed, but did not vanish. Lord Ashford approves of order. That was not my question. A breeze moved across the fields, carrying the smell of wet earth and chimney smoke. Emily looked toward Ashford Manor in the distance, its towers pale against the grey sky, elegant and cold and watching. Then perhaps it is not one I should answer. Alexander said nothing for a moment. He was accustomed to women who filled silence with charm, to men who filled it with excuses, to households where suffering was hidden behind polished silver. Emily did neither. She stood before him with daisies slipping from her golden hair and dignity wrapped around her like a cloak too thin for the weather. Beautiful. Lively. Wounded, though she refused to name the wound. One of the children tugged at her sleeve. Miss Emily, will you come tomorrow? Her face changed instantly, sunlight through clouds. She bent with easy warmth and touched the child's shoulder. If the rain behaves and your spelling improves by at least 1 word. 2 words, the boy declared. Then I shall bring pears. The children cheered, and Emily laughed, bright and breathless, the sound striking Alexander with unexpected force. It was not the practiced laugh of a drawing room. It had survived neglect. That made it rare. When she turned back, she seemed to remember herself and lowered her eyes. Forgive me, Your Grace. The children forget formality. Children often remember what adults ruin, he said. Emily looked at him then, startled by the quiet honesty. Before she could answer, a rider appeared from the manor road, Mr. Vale at last, his hat low, his expression pinched with irritation. He took in the scene, the Duke standing beside Emily, the blankets, the children, the muddy hem, and his mouth tightened. My lady, he said, with the kind of bow that carried no respect. Lord Ashford requested that you return to the house immediately. Emily's fingers closed around the empty basket on her arm. I have not finished here. His lordship was specific. The steward's gaze flicked to Alexander, then away. Miss Hale is arranging the dinner seating for tonight. Your presence is required to avoid confusion. For one heartbeat, Emily's brightness faltered. Alexander saw it. Not tears. Not anger. Something worse. The small, practiced folding away of self. Of course, she said. Tell his lordship I will return within the hour. He said immediately. The word landed hard, and the children went silent again. Emily lifted her chin, ready to obey because obedience had kept peace for so long that even pain had begun to look like duty. But Alexander stepped beside her, close enough that Mr. Vale's posture changed. Lady Ashford is assisting my inspection of the boundary cottages, he said. She will return when that inspection is complete. Mr. Vale blinked. Your Grace, I do not believe Lord Ashford intended, then Lord Ashford may speak to me. The steward swallowed the rest of his sentence. Emily stood very still, the basket handle creaking softly beneath her hand. No one had ever delayed William's command for her. No one had ever placed their rank between her and humiliation as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Alexander turned toward her, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. Beneath the restraint, she saw anger. Not loud. Not reckless. Honorable anger, held like a blade that would not be drawn unless necessary. Shall we continue, Lady Ashford? He asked. Emily looked at the cottages, the children, the wet road, the manor waiting like a closed fist. Then that lively spark returned, faint but real. Yes, Your Grace, she said. There are 3 more roofs you should see. The 3 roofs became 5, and by the time Emily and Duke Alexander Whitmore returned from the lower cottages, the rain had thinned into a silver mist that clung to the hedges and darkened the road beneath their feet. Mr. Vale had ridden ahead in visible displeasure, no doubt eager to carry his version of the morning back to Ashford Manor, but Emily found she could not regret the delay. For 2 hours, she had walked beside a man who listened. Not politely. not as if waiting for her to finish. Truly listened. When she explained which cottages flooded after heavy rain, Alexander asked where the drainage ditch had failed. When she mentioned that 3 families shared one well nearly half a mile away, he asked who owned the strip of land between them and the spring. When she spoke of the schoolhouse roof, he did not call it sentimental. He asked how much slate would be needed. Such questions should not have felt like kindness. Yet to Emily they did. "You have been managing more of this estate than anyone admits," he said as they approached the manor gates. Emily's basket rested against her arm, empty now except for a few crushed daisies and a damp ribbon one of the children had tied around the handle. She looked ahead at the ironwork gates, their black spears rising against the gray afternoon. "I manage what falls through the cracks." "And how much has fallen?" Her smile was quick, beautiful, and tired. "Enough to keep me occupied." Alexander stopped just before the gates. His horse followed behind them, led by one of his grooms at a respectful distance. "Lady Ashford, forgive the directness, but does your husband know the condition of his tenants?" Emily's fingers moved over the basket handle. "William knows what is written in reports. Reports can be arranged. So can marriages." The answer escaped quietly, sharper than she intended. She lowered her eyes at once. "Forgive me. Do not apologize for telling the truth." She looked up, startled again by the firmness in his voice. The mist had gathered on his dark coat and touched his black hair with silver. There was nothing soft in his face, nothing easily readable, but she was beginning to understand that gentleness did not always look gentle. Sometimes it looked like restraint. Sometimes it looked like a man choosing his words because anger would be too easy. They entered the manor through the side hall, where the warmth struck Emily's chilled cheeks and the smell of polished wood returned like an old rule. A footman hurried forward to take her cloak, but before he could speak, music drifted from the drawing room. Vanessa was playing the piano. Not well, but loudly, each note bright and careless. Laughter followed. William's voice, low and indulgent. Emily paused. Alexander noticed. "You need not go in." "In this house," Emily said softly, "absence is always used as evidence." She handed her cloak to the footman and walked toward the drawing room with her head high. Alexander followed at a measured distance, close enough to make every servant in the corridor straighten. Inside, Vanessa sat at the piano wearing Emily's pearl bracelet again, her ivory sleeves falling elegantly over her wrists. William stood beside the mantel with a glass of cider untouched in his hand. Several neighbors had arrived for an informal luncheon, though Emily had not been told. The moment she entered, conversation faltered. Vanessa turned from the keys and smiled. "There she is. We feared you had lost your way among the cottages." Emily returned the smile with flawless grace. "No. I found exactly what needed finding." A murmur moved through the room. William's gaze flicked to the mud at her hem, then to Alexander behind her. "You kept his grace waiting in the rain?" "On the contrary," Alexander said before Emily could answer. "Lady Ashford gave me the most useful tour of your land I have had in years." William's expression cooled. How generous of her. Vanessa rose from the piano. "You must be chilled, poor thing. Walking is such a hardship when one is accustomed to being overlooked." The words were dressed as sympathy, but everyone heard the blade inside them. Emily's cheeks warmed. Still she smiled. Still she stood. Vanessa crossed the room and lifted the bracelet slightly, letting the pearls catch the firelight. "Perhaps we should have asked you to join us earlier, but William said you prefer useful little errands." Something in the room tightened. Alexander's eyes lowered to the pearls, then returned to Emily's face. He saw recognition there. Not surprise. Pain carefully mastered. That was when he understood the cruelty was not new. It had habits. It had furniture. It wore jewelry stolen from memory and called itself elegance. Emily moved to the tea table and began pouring as if her hands were not cold. "Tea, Your Grace?" she asked. Alexander watched her lift the pot, steady as a queen in exile. "Yes," he said. "If you will allow me the honor." William's fingers tightened around his glass. Vanessa's smile sharpened. Emily looked at Alexander, and for one brief, dangerous second, the room seemed to fall away. He was not rescuing her with noise. He was doing something far more unsettling. He was recognizing her in public. And in Ashford Manor, that was almost a rebellion. By late afternoon, the house had begun to rearrange itself around Duke Alexander Whitmore's attention, though no servant dared say so aloud. In the drawing room, tea cooled in porcelain cups while conversation tried and failed to recover its former ease. Emily poured for every guest with graceful hands, her beautiful face composed, her hazel eyes bright beneath lashes still darkened by the mist outside. She laughed when Lady Morton asked about the village children, and for a moment the sound warmed the room so naturally that several guests smiled before remembering whom they were expected to favor. William noticed. Vanessa noticed more. She sat near the piano with Emily's pearls circling her wrist, watching as Alexander accepted his cup directly from Emily and inclined his head as though receiving something of consequence. "You take sugar, Your Grace?" Emily asked. "Not today," he said. "You have already given me enough sweetness in truth." The words were proper. Perfectly harmless. Yet the room heard the honor inside them. William's mouth hardened. Vanessa set down her cup with a delicate click. "How fortunate that Your Grace finds village errands so charming," she said. "Some men prefer women who understand drawing rooms." Alexander looked at her then, calmly enough to make her regret wanting his attention. "A woman who understands hungry children and leaking roofs will not be confused by a drawing room, Miss Hale. The reverse is not always true." Silence. A small, devastating silence. Emily lowered her gaze to hide the quick flash of laughter that rose in her despite everything. It was the kind of laughter that had once come easily to her, bright and almost musical, before Ashford Manor taught her to swallow joy before it embarrassed someone. Alexander saw the corner of her mouth tremble. He looked away first, as if protecting even that small rebellion from becoming a spectacle. The luncheon ended with stiff bows and colder smiles. Guests departed under a sky bruised purple by evening, carrying with them the first threads of a story none of them fully understood. Emily stood in the hall as cloaks were gathered and carriages called, every inch the gracious lady of the house. Vanessa disappeared upstairs, her footsteps quick with irritation. William remained near the library door, one hand resting on the brass handle. When the final guest left, he turned to Emily. "You enjoyed yourself today?" Emily folded her hands before her. "I tried to be agreeable." "You tried to be admired." The accusation was quiet, but the servants at the far end of the hall heard enough to still their movements. Emily's cheeks colored. "I answered questions about the estate." "You contradicted Miss Hale in front of my guests." "No," Emily said softly. "His Grace did." William's eyes narrowed. "And you liked that?" She should have denied it. She knew the safer answer, the careful answer, the one that lowered the temperature of the room. But some part of her was still standing in the rain beside cottage roofs, hearing a duke ask how many slates were needed as if her concerns were not foolish. "Yes," she said. "I liked seeing courtesy offered where cruelty had been expected." William stepped closer, not enough to touch, only enough to remind the house of his authority. "You forget your position." Emily looked up at him, and the old lively spark returned, thin but unmistakable. "No, William. I remember it every day. I am the one everyone else forgets." For the first time in years, he had no answer ready. The library door opened behind him, and Alexander stepped out, holding a folded document he had apparently been reviewing with the steward before the luncheon. He had heard enough. Not all. Enough. William turned sharply. Your Grace, this is a household matter. Alexander's gaze moved from William to Emily, then to the servants pretending not to listen. Then perhaps it should be handled with the dignity a household deserves. William's face chilled into politeness. You are a guest here. For the moment. The words were mild, but something in them settled over the hall like the first weight of snow. Emily sensed danger in that calm. Not for herself. For the fragile arrangement of lies that kept Ashford Manor standing. That evening, after the house quieted and Vanessa's door closed in the south wing, Emily went to the small chapel at the rear of the manor. She often came there when the walls felt too narrow. Moonlight spilled through the stained glass in pale blue and silver, touching the pews, the altar cloth, the empty vase where she sometimes placed flowers from the garden. She knelt, not because she had words to pray, but because kneeling alone felt different from being made small before others. A sound came from the aisle. She turned. Alexander stood near the chapel doors, his hat in his hand, his expression shadowed. Forgive me, he said. I did not know anyone was here. Emily rose quickly, brushing at her skirt. I was just leaving. You need not leave every room I enter. The gentleness of it undid her more than pity would have. She smiled, but it faltered. It is a habit. Alexander looked toward the empty vase. A poor habit for a woman who fills every neglected place she touches. Emily's breath caught. She looked away, and one tear escaped before she could command it back. Only one. She wiped it quickly, almost angrily. Please forget that. He took one step forward and stopped, leaving the choice of distance to her. No, he said quietly. Some things should finally be remembered. Emily did not sleep after the chapel. Long after Duke Alexander Whitmore had bowed and left her alone with the moonlit pews, his words remained behind like a candle that refused to go out. Some things should finally be remembered. She had spent 3 years teaching herself to disappear so carefully that even her own heart had grown quiet from lack of use, yet someone had looked at her grief and not turned away. By morning, Ashford Manor seemed colder than before, not because the fires had failed, but because every hallway knew a change was coming. Servants moved with lowered eyes. Mrs. Bell pressed Emily's hand a moment longer than usual when delivering the breakfast tray. Mr. Vale avoided her entirely. Vanessa, however, bloomed in the tension. She appeared at luncheon in a pale ivory gown with Emily's pearl bracelet shining at her wrist and a smile sharpened for an audience. William has been most thoughtful, she announced, letting her fingers trail across the back of the chair at the head of the table. He believes a house runs best when everyone accepts the place suited to them. Emily stood near the sideboard, lovely in a soft lavender dress, her golden hair pinned with a ribbon the color of spring rain. She looked young again for one dangerous instant, not childish, but vivid, alive, as if every insult had failed to dull the brightness God had placed in her. And what place has Lord Ashford suited to me today? She asked. William entered before Vanessa could answer. He carried a sealed envelope and wore the expression of a man who had mistaken control for victory. Duke Alexander followed a few steps behind him, formally invited to review the disputed boundary papers before dinner, though his presence now felt less like courtesy and more like witness. William placed the envelope on the table. For your comfort and the order of this house, you will move to the north attic rooms until further arrangements are made. Miss Hale will assume management of domestic matters. The servants froze. Even the fire seemed to soften its crackle. Emily looked at the envelope, then at the man who had married her at 17 and spent 3 years removing her piece by piece from her own life. The attic, she repeated. Her voice was calm, but her hand touched the edge of the table for balance. Vanessa gave a small laugh. Do not make it sound tragic. Many women would be grateful for a roof. The old Emily might have lowered her eyes. The obedient Emily might have nodded. But the girl who had laughed with children in the rain, who had sold jewels to mend roofs, who had filled cold rooms with flowers, lifted her chin instead. I have been grateful for very little in this house, Miss Hale, but I have been patient with much. William's face hardened. Enough. Yes, Emily said softly. It is. A sound came from the doorway. Alexander had stepped forward. Not quickly. Not dramatically. With the terrible steadiness of a man who had waited until the truth exposed itself. Before Lady Ashford is removed from any room, he said, perhaps Lord Ashford would care to explain these. He placed 3 folded papers beside William's envelope. The first bore the mark of the village bank. The second, the signature of the steward. The third, a list of jewels transferred without Emily's consent, including the bracelet on Vanessa's wrist. Color drained from Vanessa's face. William stared at the papers, silent for 1 beat too long. Alexander continued, his voice low and exact. Funds from Lady Ashford's marriage portion were redirected to private accounts. Her property was reassigned. Her charitable expenditures were reported as instability, while your own withdrawals were concealed as estate repairs. Emily's breath caught. She had suspected cruelty. She had not known it had been written down. William recovered with a cold smile. You involve yourself in matters that do not concern you. A woman being stripped of dignity under the shelter of law concerns every honorable man. Vanessa unclasped the bracelet as if it had burned her. The pearls fell onto the table with a soft, final sound. Emily looked at them, and for the first time, she did not reach for what had been taken. William's voice dropped. She is my wife. Alexander turned to him. Then you should have protected her name instead of profiting from her silence. No one moved. Emily felt every eye in the room upon her, but for once their attention did not feel like shame. It felt like air. Alexander lifted his dark coat from the back of a chair and placed it around her shoulders with careful respect, leaving space between them, offering shelter without command. Lady Ashford, he said, and his voice changed when he spoke to her, becoming something quieter than power. You owe no one obedience that requires you to vanish. Emily looked at William, then at Vanessa, then at the house that had taught her how to smile while breaking. Slowly, she drew the wedding ring from her finger. She set it beside the pearls. The sound was almost nothing. It changed everything. William stepped forward, anger flashing through his composure. You will not walk out under his protection. Emily's smile returned, bright and beautiful through the ache. No, William. I will walk out under my own dignity. Alexander stood beside her, still as a vow. William looked at him with bitter disbelief. And what is she to you? The Duke's eyes did not leave Emily's face. Not property. Not conquest. Not pity. He paused, and the whole manor seemed to hold its breath. Mine, if she chooses. Honored, even if she does not. Emily's hand closed lightly around the pearls, not for the past, but for her mother's memory. Then she turned toward the open doors where rain had stopped and a clean gray morning waited beyond the steps. Some hearts do not awaken when they are claimed. They awaken when they are finally given the choice to belong to themselves.